They came screaming in the dark. We answered with fire. I can still hear it, that sound that no man should ever have to hear. 2,000 voices crying out in unison, a death song echoing across the blood-soaked fields of Saipan. It was July 7, 1944, and I was sitting in the driver's seat of a 30-ton Sherman tank, watching hell itself pour down from the hills above Tanapag Plain. My name is Sergeant Tommy Richardson, and I was 22 years old that night. Old enough to know fear when I saw it coming, young enough to think I might live forever. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was right about one. That night would change everything. The radio crackled to life in our tank, call sign Fury. All units, this is command. Massive enemy formation moving south toward Aslito Airfield, estimated 2,000 strong. Hold your positions at all costs. Repeat, hold at all costs. Staff Sergeant Mike Kowalski, our tank commander, keyed his mic. Roger that, command. Fury is in position. I looked through my periscope at the thin line of American armor stretched across the plain. 12 Sherman tanks, that's all we had between 2,000 desperate Japanese soldiers and the airfield that kept our P-47 Thunderbolts flying. 12 tanks against an entire regiment of men who had already decided to die, whispered Bobby Martinez, our loader. He was 19, fresh-faced, and had a girl named Maria waiting for him back in San Antonio. 2,000 of them? Shut it, Martinez, Kowalski growled, but there was no real anger in his voice. We were all scared. Fear was honest. Fear kept you alive. Gunner Eddie Walsh adjusted his sights and checked his ammunition counter. 75 rounds of high explosive, Sarge. Won't last long against that many. Then make every shot count, Kowalski replied. The night was thick and humid, the kind that made your uniform stick to your skin like a second layer of sweat. Saipan in July was a green hell of jungle and coral, and we'd been fighting for this godforsaken island for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of pushing the Japanese back, yard by bloody yard, until they had nowhere left to run. That's when cornered animals become most dangerous. I had been driving tanks since North Africa, through Sicily, and now here in the Pacific. I'd seen men die in a dozen different ways, but I'd never seen anything like what was coming down those hills. Through the darkness, we could hear them, not just the voices, but the sound of thousands of feet moving through the jungle, equipment rattling, swords being drawn from scabbards. The Japanese called it gyokusai, death with honor. We called it suicide. Movement, 2 o'clock, Eddie called out, his eye pressed to the gunner's periscope. Holy Mary, Mother of God. There's hundreds of them. I peered through my own vision port and felt my blood turn to ice water. They were coming down the slope like a human avalanche, silhouetted against the star-filled sky. Some carried rifles, some had bamboo spears, others wielded samurai swords that glinted in the moonlight. In the front ranks, I could see Japanese officers on horseback, their sabers raised high, leading the charge like something out of an old samurai movie. But this wasn't a movie. This was real, and they were coming to kill us. Here they come. Kowalski shouted into the radio. All tanks, open fire. Pour it on them. Eddie squeezed the trigger, and our 75mm gun roared to life. The high explosive shell screamed across the plain and detonated in the middle of the charging mass. Bodies flew through the air like broken dolls, but the charge never slowed. If anything, it got faster. Lodi! Kowalski screamed. Bobby was already moving, ejecting the spent casing and ramming home another high explosive round. Up. On the way. Eddie fired again, and again, and again. Each shot tore gaps in their lines, but the gaps filled instantly as more Japanese soldiers poured down from the hills. All along our line, the other Shermans were firing as fast as their crews could load. The noise was deafening, 12 tank guns firing in rapid succession, the crack boom of high explosive shells detonating, the rattle of machine gun fire. Our bow machine gun was chattering continuously, and I could see tracer rounds arcing through the darkness like deadly fireflies. They kept coming. The first wave hit the tank to our left, Wolverine, like a human tsunami. Japanese soldiers swarmed over the Sherman's hull, trying to jam grenades into the treads, prying at the hatches with bayonets and swords. I watched in horror as they covered the tank completely, like ants on a piece of candy. "Wolverine's in trouble," I shouted. "Keep driving, Richardson," Kowalski ordered. "We got our own problems." He was right. A group of Japanese soldiers had broken through our machine gun fire and were sprinting directly at us. I could see their faces now, young men, some barely older than teenagers, their expressions twisted with a combination of fear and fanatical determination. They carried satchel charges and grenades, and they were running straight into our guns without hesitation. Eddie traversed the main gun and fired at point-blank range. The blast literally vaporized the first rank of attackers, but more kept coming. Our coaxial machine gun hammered away, cutting down Japanese soldiers at ranges so close I could have reached out and touched them. One man made it all the way to our tank. He leaped onto our front slope armor with a satchel charge in his hands, screaming something in Japanese. I could see his face through my periscope. He couldn't have been more than 18 years old, with tears streaming down his cheeks. Bobby Martinez stuck his pistol through a vision port and shot him 3 times in the chest. The boy fell backward, the satchel charge rolling harmlessly into a shell crater. "Reloading," Bobby yelled, his hands shaking as he shoved another round into the breach. "Target front." Eddie called out. "Tank busters, moving fast." I saw them through my periscope, a squad of Japanese soldiers carrying a massive magnetic mine, running in a crouch toward our right track. These weren't the desperate, half-armed civilians from the first wave. These were Imperial Marines, professional soldiers who knew exactly what they were doing. "Traverse right." "Traverse right," Kowalski screamed. Eddie spun the turret, but they were too close, moving too fast. The lead soldier dove under our gun barrel and pressed the magnetic mine against our front drive sprocket. He had maybe 3 seconds to live, and he was smiling. The explosion lifted the front of our 30-ton tank 6 inches off the ground and blew our right track clean off. Suddenly, we were immobilized, a sitting duck in the middle of the biggest banzai charge in Pacific War history. "Track's gone," I reported, fighting to keep the panic out of my voice. "We're not going anywhere." "Then we fight from here," Kowalski said grimly. "Bobby, how much we got left?" 12 rounds, Sarge. Machine gun ammo. Maybe 200 rounds on the coax, 150 on the bow gun. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. There were still over 1,000 Japanese soldiers coming down that hill, and we were fixed in place like a steel coffin. The radio crackled with desperate voices from the other tanks in our line. "Grizzly is down. Grizzly is down. They're all over us. Need support at grid 274. There's too many of them." Through the chaos, I could hear our tank commander trying to coordinate the defense. "All units, maintain your positions. Do not fall back. Repeat, do not fall back." But tanks were falling back. 3 Shermans to our right had already reversed out of their positions, their crews overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of attacking infantry. That left huge gaps in our line, gaps that thousands of screaming Japanese soldiers were pouring through. "They're gonna break through," I said, more to myself than anyone else. "Not if we can help it," Kowalski replied. He grabbed the radio microphone. "Command, this is Fury. We've got visual on the airfield. Enemy forces are 300 yards from the runway. We need immediate support or they're gonna overrun Aslito." The reply came back through heavy static. "Fury, reinforcements are 20 minutes out. Hold your position." 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Another wave of Japanese soldiers came charging across the plain, and this time they had figured out our weaknesses. Instead of running straight at us, they were using shell craters and knocked out vehicles for cover, working their way closer in small groups before making their final rushes. Movement. 11 o'clock, Eddie called out. Looks like a squad with demo charges. Our main gun roared again, and the high explosive shell turned the shell crater they were hiding in into a smoking pit. But for every group we killed, 2 more appeared. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. About 500 yards away, a large group of Japanese soldiers was setting up what looked like a mountain gun, a small artillery piece they had somehow managed to drag down from the hills. If they got that thing operational, they could punch holes in our armor from outside machine gun range. Sarge, they got a gun. Japanese mountain gun, 500 yards, 12 o'clock. Kowalski raised his binoculars and swore. Son of a Eddie, can you hit it? At this range with E? Maybe. Gonna take a perfect shot. Then make it perfect. Eddie took his time, adjusting his sights, calculating range and windage. Around us, the battle raged on. Machine guns chattered, grenades exploded, men screamed and died. But for that moment, everything in our tank was focused on that one shot. On the way, the 75mm gun bucked, and we watched the tracer arc across the plain. For what seemed like an eternity, nothing happened. Then the shell hit the mountain gun dead center, detonating the ammunition they had stacked beside it. The explosion lit up the night like a miniature sun, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left but twisted metal and silence. Got him, Bobby whooped. But our celebration was short-lived. The destruction of their artillery piece seemed to enrage the Japanese attackers, and they came at us with renewed fury. This time, they were using a different tactic, human wave attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, trying to overwhelm us with sheer numbers. They came from the front, the sides, and even tried to circle around behind us. Japanese soldiers emerged from spider holes we didn't even know existed, firing knee mortars and throwing grenades. The noise was incredible, a continuous roar of gunfire, explosions, and screaming voices in 2 languages. Our machine guns were running dangerously low on ammunition. The coaxial gun jammed twice, and each time Bobby had to perform field maintenance while enemy soldiers were literally climbing onto our tank. The bow machine gun was so hot from continuous firing that the barrel was glowing red in the darkness. We're running dry, Sarge, I reported. Maybe 50 rounds left on the bow gun, 20 on the coax. Main gun ammo? 8 rounds, that's it. 8 rounds against 1,000 enemies. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. That's when I heard the sound that still haunts my dreams, the sound of metal tearing. Someone had managed to jam a crowbar or bayonet into our turret ring and was trying to pry open our commander's hatch from the outside. They're on the turret, Kowalski yelled. He grabbed his Thompson submachine gun and prepared to open the hatch, but I grabbed his arm. Don't open it, Sarge. There's too many of them. Instead, he rotated the turret. The massive weight of the turning turret crushed whatever was trying to break in, and we heard a scream that cut off abruptly. But they kept coming. More Japanese soldiers clambered onto our hull, and this time they had satchel charges. I could hear them moving around above us, talking in rapid Japanese, preparing to blow us to kingdom come. That's when I did something that probably saved our lives, but definitely violated about 12 different Army regulations. I popped the driver's hatch just far enough to stick the barrel of my .45 pistol through and started shooting blind into the darkness above us. The first shot was lucky. I heard a scream and the sound of a body falling off the tank. The second shot must have hit someone's hand because a satchel charge went off prematurely about 10 feet from our left side. The explosion rocked the tank but didn't penetrate our armor. Nice shooting, Richardson. Kowalski grinned. Now close that hatch before they drop a grenade down it. I slammed the hatch shut just as something heavy landed on top of it, probably another satchel charge. But it must have been a dud because nothing happened. By this time, The other tanks in our line were in desperate straits. I could see Thunderbolt burning about 50 yards to our left, thick black smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Iron Duke was completely surrounded by Japanese infantry, and I could see muzzle flashes from inside the tank. The crew was fighting with pistols and submachine guns in the crew compartment. "We're getting overrun," I said quietly. "Not yet, we're not," Kowalski replied, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Then, just when it looked like we were finished, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the deep-throated roar of aircraft engines. Big aircraft engines. "Air support," Eddie shouted. "I can see 'em. B-25s, coming in low." The Mitchell bombers came screaming across Saipan at about 200 feet, their bomb bay doors already open. The lead aircraft dropped a string of 500-pound bombs right into the thickest concentration of Japanese troops, and the explosions lit up the night like a chain of volcanoes. But these weren't just any B-25s. These were the specially modified gunships from the 42nd Bomb Squadron, bristling with forward-firing machine guns and cannon. As they pulled up from their bombing runs, they raked the entire battlefield with 50 caliber machine gun fire, cutting down Japanese soldiers by the hundreds. The effect was immediate and devastating. The coordinated Japanese attack began to fragment as soldiers dove for cover or simply disintegrated under the concentrated firepower from above. For the first time all night, the pressure on our tank line began to ease. "Holy, look at that." Bobby pressed his face to a periscope and watched as the bombers made their second pass. "They're getting slaughtered," he was right. The Japanese attack, which had been so disciplined and coordinated just minutes before, was falling apart under the aerial bombardment. Soldiers were running in all directions, some back toward the hills, others continuing their suicidal charges toward our tanks. But without leadership and coordination, they were just individual targets for our machine guns. Eddie traversed the main gun toward a group of about 30 Japanese soldiers who were still trying to advance on our position. At this range, with high explosive ammunition, it was like shooting fish in a barrel. On the way, the shell detonated in the middle of the group, and when the smoke cleared, there was nothing left moving. 7 rounds left, Bobby reported. But we didn't need 7 rounds. The combination of air support and concentrated tank fire had finally broken the back of the massive banzai charge. Japanese soldiers were retreating in small groups, carrying their wounded, leaving hundreds of bodies scattered across Tanapak Plain. As dawn began to break over Saipan, the true scale of the carnage became visible. From horizon to horizon, the plain was covered with the bodies of Japanese soldiers. They lay in neat rows where our machine gun fire had cut them down, in scattered groups where artillery had found them, and in twisted heaps where our tank guns had made direct hits. I opened my driver's hatch and climbed out onto the hull of our Sherman. The morning air was thick with smoke and the smell of cordite and death. In the distance, I could see American infantry moving across the battlefield, checking bodies and collecting weapons. I whispered. Kowalski climbed out of the commander's hatch and stood beside me, surveying the scene. "I've never seen anything like it." Neither had I. The intelligence reports later estimated that we had killed over 1,500 Japanese soldiers that night. 1,500 men who had charged across open ground against tanks and machine guns, knowing they were going to die, but doing it anyway. The other members of our crew joined us on the hull. Bobby Martinez took off his helmet and ran his fingers through his sweat-soaked hair. "How many you think we got, Sarge?" Kowalski shrugged. "Does it matter? They're dead. We're alive. That's what matters." But as I looked out at that field of corpses, I couldn't help but think about the young Japanese soldier who had jumped onto our tank with the satchel charge. He had been crying when Bobby shot him. Crying, but still trying to complete his mission. These weren't monsters we had fought. They were young men, just like us, who believed in something strongly enough to die for it. The tragedy wasn't just that they had died, it was that they had it for nothing. Their sacrifice hadn't saved Saipan, hadn't stopped the American advance, hadn't even delayed it by more than a few hours. Reinforcements are coming up, Eddie reported, pointing toward a column of American tanks moving across the plain. Looks like the whole 2nd Armored Division. Too little, too late for the Japanese. But then again, maybe that had been the point. Maybe General Saito had known his men were going to die anyway, and had decided to make their deaths count for something, even if that something was just honor. Over the next few hours, as recovery teams cleaned up the battlefield and engineers worked to get our tank mobile again, I learned more about what had happened that night. The Japanese attack had been led by General Yoshitsugu Saito himself, the commander of the 43rd Division. He had ordered the largest banzai charge in the history of the Pacific War, throwing every man he had left, soldiers, sailors, civilian volunteers, even the walking wounded from field hospitals, into one final, desperate assault. They had come so close to succeeding. If not for the arrival of the B-25s, if not for the heroic stand of 12 Sherman tanks on Tanapag Plain, they might have reached Aslito Airfield. They might have destroyed our aircraft, disrupted our supply lines, maybe even changed the course of the battle for Saipan. But they didn't. They died instead, almost to a man, in a field of coral and mud 10,000 miles from home. By noon, bulldozers were digging mass graves, and the business of war was continuing. P-47 Thunderbolts were taking off from Aslito Airfield, heading north to bomb Japanese positions on the rest of the island. Supply ships were unloading ammunition and fuel at the beachhead. The 27th Infantry Division was advancing toward the northern cliffs, mopping up the last pockets of Japanese resistance. In 3 more days, Saipan would be declared secure. In 6 weeks, American 29 superfortresses would be flying bombing missions against Japan itself from the runways we had defended. In 13 months, the war would be over. But for me, the war would never really end. Every night for the next 60 years, I would dream about that young Japanese soldier with tears on his face, jumping onto our tank with a bomb in his hands. I would dream about the sound of 2,000 voices screaming in the darkness, and the way our machine guns answered with fire and death. People ask me sometimes if I'm proud of what we did that night on Saipan. It's a complicated question. Am I proud that we stopped a banzai charge that could have prolonged the Pacific War months? Yes. Am I proud that we saved American lives and protected a vital airfield? Yes. Am I proud that 12 tank crews held their ground against impossible odds and won a victory that helped end the war faster? Yes, I'm proud of that. But I'm not proud of the killing. War makes killers of us all, and killing, even necessary killing, even justified killing, leaves scars on a man's soul that never fully heal. The Japanese soldiers who died on Tanapag Plain that night weren't evil men. They were soldiers, doing their duty as they understood it, dying for their country and their emperor, just as we were prepared to die for ours. The tragedy of war isn't just that good men die, it's that good men kill each other for causes they may not fully understand, in places they never wanted to be, far from the people they love. When I came home from the war, I married my high school sweetheart, raised 3 children, and ran a hardware store in small-town Iowa for 43 years. I never talked about Saipan, not to my wife, not to my children, not to anybody. What was there to say? That I had helped kill 1,500 men in a single night? That I had watched boys my own age die for nothing more than honor and duty? It wasn't until my grandson started asking questions about World War II for a school project that I finally began to tell the story. And even then, I could never bring myself to describe that young Japanese soldier's face or the sound he made when Bobby Martinez shot him. Some memories are too heavy to share, even with the people you love most. But I'm telling the story now because I'm 92 years old, and there aren't many of us left who remember what happened on Saipan that night. The historians can tell you about troop movements and casualty figures and strategic objectives. They can explain why the battle was important, how it fit into the larger context of the Pacific War, what it meant for American strategy in 1944. What they can't tell you is what it felt like to be inside that tank, listening to enemy soldiers die outside, knowing that our ammunition was running low and that reinforcements were still 20 minutes away. They can't tell you about the smell of cordite and blood, or the weight of decisions made in split seconds under impossible circumstances. They can't tell you about the sound of 2,000 voices screaming in the darkness, or the silence that followed when those voices were finally stilled. That's why I'm telling this story. Not because I want to glorify war or celebrate killing, but because someone needs to remember what really happened on Tanapak Plain on the night of July 7, 1944. Someone needs to remember the Japanese soldiers who died for honor, and the American tankers who lived because they were better armed and better positioned and luckier than their enemies. Someone needs to remember that war is not glorious or romantic or noble, despite what the movies might tell you. War is young men dying far from home, in ugly, desperate, necessary ways, for reasons that seem clear at the time, but become more complicated with every passing year. The last Yokusai charge on Saipan killed over 1,500 Japanese soldiers and ended the effective resistance on the island. It was a tactical disaster that accomplished nothing except to hasten Japan's defeat and increase the casualty count on both sides. But it was also an act of courage, misguided courage, perhaps, futile courage, but courage nonetheless. Those men knew they were going to die, and they charged anyway. They chose death over surrender, honor over survival, duty over self-preservation. I don't understand that choice, even after all these years. I'm glad they made it, because it meant the war ended sooner and fewer American boys died. But I can't help but respect it, too, in a way that probably makes me a better man than I have any right to be. They came screaming in the dark. We answered with fire. And when the sun rose over Saipan on July 8, 1944, the Pacific War was one step closer to being over, and I was one step closer to becoming the old man who tells this story to anyone willing to listen. Remember them all, the Japanese boys who died for honor, and the American boys who lived to come home. Remember the night when 2,000 voices cried out in the darkness, and 12 tanks held the line against impossible odds. Remember Saipan.